face went white as Court Administrator Wilson rushed in, stammering, "What have you done? That's Judge Hayes. She presides over this courtroom." The handcuffed woman on the floor looked up, blood trickling from her split lip, her judicial composure intact, even in chains. "Officer Manning," she said quietly, "you've made a grave mistake." Welcome back to Powder Room Tales. If you're new, hit subscribe and join our family. Tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? Washington? New York? London? Wherever you are, may peace and favor follow you today. Now, let's dive into the story. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Courtroom 4B, casting long shadows across the polished wooden benches. Judge Victoria Hayes adjusted her black robes one final time before stepping through the door that connected her chambers to the bench. At 45, she commanded respect with every measured step, her presence filling the room with an authority earned through 15 years on the bench and 10 years as a prosecutor before that. "All rise," called Bailiff Thompson, his voice echoing in the packed courtroom. "The Honorable Judge Victoria Hayes presiding." Hayes took her seat, scanning the familiar faces of regular attorneys, court reporters, and clerks who made this place run. Maria Santos, her court clerk, offered a subtle nod. Everything was ready for today's high-profile embezzlement case. Attorney Michael Torres sat at the plaintiff's table, organizing his papers with methodical precision. The defendant's expensive legal team occupied the other side, their confidence evident in their casual posture. "Good morning," Hayes began, her voice carrying the perfect balance of warmth and authority. "Before we proceed with opening statements in People v. Hartwell, are there any preliminary matters?" This was her domain. Here, she was not just another black woman navigating a predominantly white institution. She was the final word, the arbiter of justice, respected by all who entered her courtroom. The morning proceeded smoothly, each procedural step handled with the efficiency that had earned her recognition as one of the county's most effective judges. During the lunch recess, Hayes retreated to her chambers, where framed diplomas from Harvard Law School and Howard University shared wall space with commendations from the State Bar Association. A photo of her parents sat prominently on her desk. Her father, a postal worker who had sacrificed everything for her education, and her mother, a teacher who had instilled in her the belief that excellence was the only response to prejudice. "Judge Hayes," Maria knocked softly on the door. "The afternoon session is ready whenever you are." "Thank you, Maria. I'll be right out." Hayes stood, straightening her robes again. It was a habit she developed early in her career, a physical reminder of the dignity and authority her position commanded. Meanwhile, 3 floors down in the security office, Officer Derek Manning was finishing his lunch, crumbs from his sandwich scattered across incident reports he hadn't bothered to complete. At 38, Manning had worked courthouse security for 12 years, long enough to develop strong opinions about who belonged in his building and who didn't. "You see the briefing about tomorrow?" Officer Chen asked, settling into the chair beside him. At 29, Chen had been Manning's partner for 2 years, gradually absorbing his worldview through daily exposure to his commentary. Manning pulled out a memo marked Security Alert, High-Value Target Testimony. The document warned of potential disruptions and suspicious individuals who might attempt to observe proceedings. "Yeah, same old stuff. Gotta keep an eye out for troublemakers who don't belong here." "What is that supposed to mean?" Chen asked, though she suspected she already knew. Manning's laugh had an edge to it. "Come on, Chen, you know what I mean. Some people think they can just waltz in here like they own the place, dressed all casual, sitting where they want, acting like rules don't apply to them. That's when mistakes happen, when people get too comfortable." Officer Jeanette Rodriguez, manning the metal detectors, overheard the conversation. "Manning, you know Judge Hayes heard about that complaint from last month, the one about you questioning that black attorney's credentials." Manning's jaw tightened. That guy was suspicious. Expensive suit, no briefcase, just standing around looking lost. "I was doing my job."
"He was waiting for his client," Rodriguez said quietly. "A client he'd been representing for 3 years." "Whatever," Manning waved dismissively. "Point is, we can't assume everyone belongs here just because they walk through the door. Security means being vigilant, even if it makes some people uncomfortable." Chan nodded along, though something in Rodriguez's expression made her pause. The older officer had been here longer than any of them, had seen how things used to be and how they were changing. Her disapproval was subtle but unmistakable. Up in courtroom 4B, the afternoon session was winding down. Judge Hayes had handled a complex evidence dispute with characteristic fairness, listening carefully to both sides before rendering a decision that satisfied neither party completely but served justice perfectly. "Court will adjourn until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning," she announced, bringing down her gavel with authority. "All parties are reminded that testimony begins promptly, and I expect full preparation from counsel." As the courtroom emptied, Hayes remained at the bench, reviewing her notes. Tomorrow would bring the most crucial phase of the Hartwell case, witness testimony that could determine whether a prominent businessman faced prison time for stealing from a children's charity. The public interest was intense, and she knew the courtroom would be packed with observers, media, and community members seeking justice. She gathered her materials slowly, savoring these quiet moments when the courtroom belonged entirely to her. This space represented everything she had worked for, not just personal success, but the opportunity to ensure that justice was truly blind, that every person who entered received fair treatment regardless of their background or status. Hayes made her way to her chambers, planning to review case law for several more hours. The building would be mostly empty by evening, just security staff and a few late-working attorneys. She liked the quiet, the sense of dedication that came with staying late to ensure every decision was properly considered. What she didn't know was that Manning had requested evening overtime, eager to demonstrate his vigilance during the high-profile case. What she couldn't foresee was that her decision to return to the courtroom early the next morning to spend a few quiet moments preparing in the space where she commanded such respect would lead to a collision that would change everything. As Hayes locked her chamber's door that evening, she felt the familiar satisfaction of a day well served. Justice had been rendered fairly, the law had been upheld, and tomorrow would bring another opportunity to make a difference. She had no idea that tomorrow would test everything she believed about justice, dignity, and the system she had devoted her life to serving. Have you ever assumed someone didn't belong somewhere based on how they looked? What does it say about our society when even judges aren't immune to prejudice and violence? This story exposes the uncomfortable truth about bias in our justice system. If you've ever wondered how deep these problems really go, you need to see where this leads. Subscribe now, because what happens to Judge Hayes next will shock you, and it might be the wake-up call our society desperately needs. Don't let this story disappear into the algorithm. Hit that subscribe button before you forget, because missing what comes next would be a mistake you'll regret. Judge Victoria Hayes arrived at the courthouse at 7:30 a.m., a full hour and a half before court would convene. She had changed into civilian clothes, dark jeans, a cream-colored blouse, and comfortable flats, planning to review her notes in the peaceful quiet of her courtroom before donning her robes for the day's proceedings. The Hartwell embezzlement case would require her complete focus, and she found that sitting in the gallery, seeing the courtroom from the perspective of those seeking justice, helped center her thoughts. The morning security guard, Officer Jeanette Rodriguez, waved her through the employee entrance with a familiar smile. "Early morning, Judge Hayes?" "You know me, Janet. I like the quiet before the storm." Hayes made her way up to courtroom 4B, her footsteps echoing softly in the empty corridors. She pushed through the heavy wooden doors and breathed in the familiar scent of polished wood and old leather. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the witness stand where today's crucial testimony would unfold. She settled into the third row of the gallery, spreading her files across the bench beside her. From here, she could visualize how the day would proceed, anticipate the sightlines for the jury, and mentally prepare for the complex legal arguments ahead. It was a ritual that had served her well for 15 years on the bench. 20 minutes later, Officers Derek Manning and Lisa Chen entered the courtroom for their routine morning security sweep. Manning had requested the early shift, eager to demonstrate extra vigilance during the high-profile case. He scanned the room with practiced efficiency until his eyes landed on Hayes. "Excuse me, ma'am. This courtroom is closed to the public until 9 o'clock. Hayes looked up from her papers, offering a polite smile. "Good morning, Officer Manning. I'm just preparing for today's session."
Manning's expression hardened. Something about her casual attire and the way she sat so comfortably in his courtroom triggered every bias-driven alarm he'd developed over 12 years. "I'm going to need to see some identification. You can't be in here without authorization." "Officer, I'm Judge Hayes. This is my courtroom." Her voice remained calm, professional, though a familiar tension began building in her chest, the same feeling she'd experienced countless times when her authority was questioned simply because of how she looked. Chen shifted uncomfortably behind Manning, recognizing the judge's name, but uncertain in the face of her partner's confidence. Hayes wasn't wearing her robes, and sitting in civilian clothes in the gallery, she looked like any other observer. "Right," Manning scoffed, stepping closer. "And I'm the Supreme Court Justice. Look, lady, I don't know what game you're playing, but you need to leave, now." Hayes stood slowly, maintaining her composure despite the growing alarm in her chest. "Officer Manning, I am Judge Victoria Hayes. I preside over this courtroom. If you check with the administration—" "Don't move," Manning barked, his hand now resting on his handcuffs. "Hands where I can see them. You're trespassing in a restricted area and impersonating a public official." "Impersonating?" Hayes felt her professional calm beginning to crack. "Officer, I've been the sitting judge in this courtroom for 8 years. Call Maria Santos, my clerk. Call Judge Patterson next door. Call anyone who works in this building." Chen exchanged a look with Manning, who was reaching for her radio. "Manning, maybe we should—" "No," Manning cut her off. "This is exactly what they warned us about. People thinking they can talk their way out of trouble, make up stories." He moved closer to Hayes, towering over her 5'6" frame. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." "I will not." Hayes's voice carried the authority she'd used to control countless courtrooms, but Manning heard only defiance from someone he'd already decided was a criminal. "Officer, you are making a serious mistake. I am ordering you to stand down and verify my identity through proper channels." "Ordering me?" Manning's face flushed red. "You're ordering me in my courthouse?" In that moment, Attorney Michael Torres entered the courtroom, arriving early to prepare for his opening statement. He froze in the doorway, taking in the scene of a woman in civilian clothes facing off against 2 officers, tension crackling in the air like electricity before a storm. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for criminal trespass and impersonating a public official," Manning announced, lunging forward to grab Hayes's arm. Hayes instinctively pulled back. "Don't touch me. I am Judge Victoria Hayes." Manning seized her wrist with excessive force, twisting it behind her back. "Resisting arrest. Chen, call for backup." "Stop!" Hayes cried out, as Manning slammed her against the wooden bench where she'd sitting moments before. The impact sent her file scattering across the floor, legal documents mixing with the dust motes dancing in the morning sunlight. Torres fumbled for his phone, his hand shaking as he began recording. "Officer, stop! That's Judge Hayes!" Manning ignored him, wrestling the handcuffs onto Hayes's wrists as she struggled against the bench. "Stop resisting or I'll add assault on a peace officer to your charges." "I'm not resisting," Hayes gasped, her cheek pressed against the wood where defendants had sat seeking justice. Chen finally got through on her radio. "Control, we have a situation in courtroom 4B. Female suspect resisting arrest. Backup requested." The metal cuffs clicked shut around Hayes's wrists with a sound that seemed to echo forever in the sacred space where she had dispensed justice for nearly a decade. Manning hauled her upright, and she felt warm blood trickling from her split lip where it had struck the bench. "You have the right to remain silent," Manning began, his voice filled with self-righteous satisfaction. At that moment, Court Administrator Patricia Wilson burst through the courtroom doors, drawn by Chen's radio call. She stopped dead, her face draining of color as she took in the impossible scene before her. "What have you done?" Wilson stammered, rushing forward. "That's Judge Hayes. She presides over this courtroom." The silence that followed was deafening. Torres's phone captured every second as the realization dawned on Manning's face, his expression shifting from confidence to horror to desperate self-preservation in the span of heartbeats. Hayes looked up from her position against the bench, blood on her lip, handcuffs cutting into her wrists, her dignity shattered, but her authority intact. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, but carried the weight of 15 years on the bench and a lifetime of fighting for respect. "Officer Manning," she said, each word measured and precise, "you have just assaulted a sitting judge in her own courtroom. You are in contempt of this court, and you have committed a federal crime." The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, illuminating a scene that would change everything. A judge brought low in the very space where justice was supposed to reign supreme, and an officer finally beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistake. The fluorescent lights in the courthouse medical room buzzed overhead as Judge Victoria Hayes sat on the examination table, her torn blouse replaced with a hospital gown that made her feel more vulnerable than the handcuffs had. Dr. Sarah Kim worked quietly, cleaning the cut on Hayes's lip with professional efficiency, but her eyes betrayed her shock at treating a sitting judge for injuries inflicted by courthouse security. "The swelling should go down in a few days," Dr. Kim said softly, applying a butterfly bandage. "But Judge Hayes, these bruises on your wrists, they're going to be visible for at least a week." Hayes nodded, her usual composure cracked but not broken. Each throb of pain reminded her of Manning's grip, of the moment when her authority had meant nothing, when her dignity had been stripped away in her own courtroom. She caught her reflection in the medical cabinet's glass door, disheveled, bandaged, looking nothing like the commanding figure who had presided over justice just hours earlier. Court Administrator Patricia Wilson burst through the door, her face flushed with panic and something else, calculation. "Victoria, thank God you're all right. This is a complete misunderstanding. We need to handle this delicately." "A misunderstanding?" Hayes's voice was quiet, dangerous. "Patricia, I was assaulted in my own courtroom by officers who refused to believe I was a judge." Wilson pulled up a chair, her tone shifting to damage control mode. "Look, I've spoken with Officer Manning. He says you weren't wearing your robes, you didn't have identification, and when he tried to verify your presence in the courtroom, you became resistant." "Resistant." Hayes repeated the word like it tasted bitter. "I told them repeatedly who I was. I explained calmly that I was reviewing materials for today's case. When they grabbed me, yes, I resisted being manhandled." "But you have to understand how it looked from their perspective," Wilson continued, her voice taking on a patronizing tone Hayes had heard too many times before. "A woman in civilian clothes, alone in a courtroom after hours, becoming agitated when questioned by security. They were just following protocol." Dr. Kim paused in her work, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Hayes caught her eye in the mirror, seeing sympathy and something else. Recognition that this conversation was happening at all was part of the problem. "Protocol,"
Hayes said slowly, does not include slamming judges against their own benches and handcuffing them like criminals. The door opened again, and Captain Robert Walsh entered, with Manning close behind. Manning had cleaned up since the incident, his uniform straightened, his expression carefully neutral. But Hayes could see the defiance in his eyes, the refusal to acknowledge what he had done. Judge Hayes, Captain Walsh began, his tone professionally respectful, but with an undercurrent of dismissal. I want to personally apologize for this unfortunate incident. Manning has given me his full report, and it's clear this was a case of mistaken identity that escalated unnecessarily. Hayes stood slowly, drawing herself up to her full height despite the hospital gown. Mistaken identity, Captain Walsh? I identified myself repeatedly. Your officer chose not to believe me. Manning stepped forward, his jaw set. Ma'am, with all due respect, you were in civilian clothes in a restricted area after hours. When I asked for identification, you became confrontational and refused to comply with basic security procedures. The lie hung in the air like poison. Hayes felt something shift inside her. Not just anger, but a cold recognition of how quickly the narrative was being rewritten, how her assault was being transformed into her fault. I became confrontational, she repeated, her judicial training helping her maintain composure while fury burned beneath the surface. By telling you I was the judge? By asking you to check with courthouse staff? By remaining seated when you were approached aggressively? You raised your voice, Manning insisted, his confidence growing with each word. You made sudden movements. In today's security climate, we can't take chances. Wilson nodded supportively. Victoria, I think what Officer Manning is trying to say is that this whole situation could have been avoided with better communication from both sides. The phrase hit Hayes like a physical blow. Both sides. As if there was an equivalence between a judge preparing for court and officers committing assault. As if her presence in her own workplace required justification. Dr. Kim finished her work and quietly excused herself, but not before giving Hayes a look that said everything. This isn't right, and we both know it. Attorney Michael Torres knocked and entered, his face grim. Hayes had called him during the medical examination, needing someone who would understand the legal implications of what had happened. Judge Hayes, I came as soon as I could. Then he noticed Manning and Walsh. His expression hardened. Officers, I think the judge needs some privacy right now.
Actually, Walsh said, crossing his arms, we were just discussing how to handle the situation internally. Judge Hayes understands that making this public would be damaging to everyone involved. Torres's eyebrows shot up. Damaging to everyone involved? A sitting judge was assaulted in her own courtroom. The only thing damaging here is the assault itself. Manning's facade began to crack. Look, maybe I used more force than necessary, but she was acting suspiciously. She fit the profile of someone who might be up to no good. The words hung in the air like a confession. Hayes saw Wilson wince, Walsh's eyes narrow in warning, and Torres's expression shift from concern to professional outrage. The profile, Hayes said quietly. And what profile would that be, Officer Manning? Manning realized his mistake too late. I just meant someone who looked out of place, someone who didn't seem like they belonged in a courtroom. Torres stepped closer to Hayes, his voice taking on the tone he used in civil rights cases. Judge Hayes, what Officer Manning is describing is racial profiling. What happened to you wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a civil rights violation. Wilson stood quickly, her panic now obvious. Now let's not jump to conclusions. This was clearly a communication breakdown, nothing more. These things happen in high-stress situations. No, Hayes said, her voice gaining strength with each word. These things happen to people who look like me.
They happen when officers make assumptions about who belongs where based on skin color rather than facts. Walsh's tone became threatening. Judge Hayes, I would be very careful about making accusations you can't prove. Officer Manning is a decorated veteran with 12 years of exemplary service. Exemplary service that includes assaulting a judge, Torres said dryly. Captain Walsh, I hope you're documenting this conversation, because every word is going into our formal complaint. The room fell silent. Hayes realized this was the moment. Her colleagues, her own courthouse administration, were choosing to protect her attackers rather than acknowledge the injustice done to her. The system she had served faithfully was closing ranks against her. I see, she said quietly, understanding flooding through her. This is how it's going to be handled. Quietly, internally. With explanations about why I'm partially to blame for being assaulted in my own workplace. Wilson reached out as if to touch her arm, then thought better of it. Victoria, we just want what's best for everyone. The courthouse, your reputation, the public's faith in our justice system. My reputation, Hayes repeated. Patricia, I was the victim of a crime, but you're worried about my reputation. She looked around the room at faces that should have shown outrage on her behalf, but instead showed calculation, self-protection, and institutional loyalty that didn't extend to her. I think I understand perfectly now, Hayes said, walking toward the door. Thank you all for making the situation so clear. As she left, she heard Walsh addressing Manning in low, urgent tones, not about discipline or consequences, but about sticking to his story and avoiding further complications. Hayes walked through the courthouse corridors in her hospital gown, past security cameras that had somehow malfunctioned during her assault, past colleagues who averted their eyes rather than ask about her obvious injuries. At that moment, she realized that seeking justice wouldn't just mean fighting Manning and Walsh, it would mean fighting the entire system that was already working to protect them and silence her. The real battle was just beginning. Judge Victoria Hayes sat in the conference room of Torres & Associates, the city's premier civil rights law firm, staring at the manila folder that would either vindicate her or destroy her career. 3 days had passed since the assault, and the bruises on her wrists had deepened to dark purple reminders of Officer Manning's grip. Across from her, attorney Michael Torres spread out documents with the methodical precision that had made him legendary in civil rights cases. Before we begin, Judge Hayes, I need you to understand what we're up against, Torres said, his voice gentle but firm. Filing formal complaints against courthouse security isn't just challenging the officers, it's challenging an entire system designed to protect law enforcement from accountability. Hayes nodded, her judicial composure intact, but her eyes reflecting the trauma of recent days. Michael, I've spent 15 years believing that system worked, that justice was possible within it. After what happened, and especially after seeing how quickly they closed ranks, I have to try. Torres pulled out his laptop, where security footage from the courthouse hallways played silently. This is what we have so far. Your movement through the building is documented up until you enter courtroom 4B. Then, mysteriously, all cameras in that area experienced technical difficulties for exactly 47 minutes.
47 minutes, Hayes repeated, understanding the implication immediately. That's not a malfunction. That's a cover-up. Exactly. But we're not without resources. Torres clicked to another file. I recorded everything on my phone from the moment I heard the commotion. Officer Manning's reaction when he realized who you were, Captain Walsh's immediate damage control, their attempts to reframe the incident, it's all documented. The video played, and Hayes watched herself on the floor of her own courtroom, handcuffed and bleeding, maintaining dignity even in the face of brutality. Manning's voice came through clearly. She fit the profile of someone who might be up to no good. That phrase right there, Torres said, pausing the video,
is our smoking gun. It establishes racial profiling as the motivation for the assault. Hayes leaned back in her chair, processing the strange experience of being both victim and legal professional, analyzing her own case. What about witnesses? Security footage from other areas? Personnel records? Torres smiled grimly. That's where it gets interesting. I've filed formal requests for Officer Manning's personnel file, use of force reports, and citizen complaints. The response has been instructive. He pulled out a stack of heavily redacted documents. Manning's file reads like Swiss cheese. 12 years of service, but large gaps where complaint records should be. 3 use-of-force incidents in the past 2 years alone, all deemed justified after internal review. Hayes studied the documents with a judge's eye for detail. These redactions aren't random. They're protecting something, or someone. My thoughts exactly. But here's what they couldn't redact. Torres produced another file. Office Janet Rodriguez from the metal detectors has agreed to speak with us. Turns out she's been documenting Manning's behavior for months. Hayes felt the first spark of hope since the assault. What kind of documentation? Incident reports, witness statements, even audio recordings of Manning making racially charged comments about court visitors. Rodriguez has been building a case within the department, but her superiors kept burying it. The door opened and Officer Rodriguez entered, still in uniform, but clearly nervous. At 52, she had the weathered look of someone who had seen too much and stayed silent too long. "Judge Hayes," Rodriguez said, extending her hand, "I'm sorry it took me this long to come forward, but after what happened to you, I couldn't stay quiet anymore." Hayes shook her hand warmly. "Officer Rodriguez, your courage in speaking up means everything. Please tell us what you've observed." Rodriguez sat down heavily, pulling out a folder thick with documentation. "Manning has been a problem for years. He targets black attorneys, court visitors, even staff members. He questions their credentials, demands extra identification, follows them around the building." She pulled out a series of incident reports. Last month, he detained a black prosecutor for 20 minutes, claiming her bar certification looked suspicious. 2 weeks ago, he physically blocked a black family from entering a courtroom where they were scheduled witnesses. Torres leaned forward. "Why wasn't this reported up the chain?" Rodriguez's laugh was bitter. "It was. Every incident properly documented, submitted to Captain Walsh. They all got labeled as procedural questions or security precautions. Walsh always backed Manning, said he was being thorough." Hayes felt anger building as the pattern became clear. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a pattern of racial harassment that the department knew about and chose to ignore. "Worse than that," Rodriguez continued, 3 days before your assault, Manning specifically requested to work the early shift during high-profile cases. He told me he wanted to keep an eye on suspicious characters who might try to disrupt proceedings. Torres made notes rapidly. "Did he define what he meant by suspicious characters?" Rodriguez nodded grimly. "He said, and I quote, 'People who don't look like they belong in a courtroom. You know the type. They dress up and act like they own the place, but you can tell they're not supposed to be there.'" The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Hayes realized that her assault hadn't been a case of mistaken identity. It had been a deliberate targeting based on racial assumptions about who belonged in positions of authority. "There's more," Rodriguez said quietly. "After your assault, Captain Walsh called a meeting with all security staff. He told us the incident was regrettable but understandable, and that we needed to support our fellow officers during this difficult time. When I asked about additional bias training, he said the problem wasn't bias, it was unclear communication protocols." Torres's expression hardened. "So the department's official position is that Judge Hayes failed to communicate properly with her attackers." "That's exactly their position. They're treating Manning like the victim of a misunderstanding, rather than the perpetrator of an assault.
Hayes stood and walked to the window, looking out at the courthouse where she had once felt safe and respected. Officer Rodriguez, are you prepared to testify about what you've witnessed? To make official statements that could end Manning's career and potentially implicate Captain Walsh? Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment. Judge Hayes, I have 28 years until retirement. Speaking up could cost me everything, my job, my pension, my reputation within the department. She paused, then looked directly at Hayes. But watching you get handcuffed and bloodied in your own courtroom, then watching the department protect the officers who did it, I can't live with staying silent anymore. Torres pulled out formal complaint documents. Then let's make this official. Judge Hayes, we're filing civil rights violations against Manning and Walsh, excessive force charges, and a federal civil rights lawsuit. Officer Rodriguez, your testimony will be the foundation of our case. Hayes returned to the table, her judicial authority returning as she committed to the fight ahead. Michael, I want more than individual accountability. I want systemic reform. I want training programs, oversight committees, and clear consequences for racial bias. What happened to me can never happen to anyone else. Torres nodded. Then we're not just seeking justice, we're seeking transformation. This case will force the entire courthouse system to confront its biases and change its culture. As they began filling out complaint forms, Hayes realized this was more than seeking justice for her assault. It was about using her position, her voice, and her pain to create lasting change that would protect others who didn't have her platform or resources. The investigation had begun, and with it, the long fight for accountability and reform. 3 weeks after the assault, Judge Victoria Hayes sat in attorney Michael Torres's cluttered office, surrounded by cardboard boxes filled with documents that painted a horrifying picture of systemic corruption. The manila folders spread across the conference table contained years of complaints, incident reports, and personnel files that should have ended Derek Manning's career long ago. This goes back 8 years, Torres said, holding up a thick file marked Manning, Derek, Internal Affairs. 37 complaints of excessive force, racial profiling, and misconduct. 37, Victoria. And every single one was either dismissed, buried, or resulted in nothing more than a written warning. Hayes picked up a complaint dated 2 years earlier. The handwritten statement was from Jamal Washington, a young black attorney who had been harassed and briefly detained by Manning while trying to enter a courtroom for his client's hearing. He describes the exact same behavior, she said quietly. The same assumptions, the same escalation, the same refusal to believe credentials. Look at this one, Torres pointed to another file. Maria Rodriguez, a court interpreter. Manning accused her of loitering while she waited for a delayed hearing. When she showed her court-issued ID, he claimed it was fake and called for backup. Assistant Public Defender Lisa Chen, not the officer, but a different Lisa Chen, had also filed a complaint. Her statement described Manning following her through the courthouse, questioning her presence repeatedly despite her clearly visible Bar Association credentials. It's like he has radar for anyone he thinks doesn't belong, she had written. But it was the pattern of protection that truly shocked Hayes. Each complaint had been investigated by the same Internal Affairs Sergeant, Robert Shaw, who happened to be Captain Walsh's brother-in-law. Every investigation concluded with phrases like insufficient evidence, complainant uncooperative, or officer acted within protocol. They weren't just ignoring the complaints, Hayes realized, her voice tight with controlled anger. They were actively covering them up. Torres nodded grimly. It gets worse. Remember how the security footage from your assault mysteriously malfunctioned? I found 7 other incidents where cameras happened to fail during Manning's confrontations with minorities. Hayes's phone buzzed with another anonymous text message. Drop this now or face consequences. She showed it to Torres, who added it to the growing collection of threats she'd been receiving. The harassment started the day after you filed the formal complaint, Torres observed. Someone's coordinating this intimidation campaign. Detective Angela Brooks, the one honest cop Torres had found willing to investigate the case, knocked on the office door. A 20-year veteran in her field, Brooks had agreed to examine the case independently after being horrified by what Torres shared with her. "I've got the information you requested," Brooks said, settling into a chair with her own thick folder. "And you're not going to like what I found." She spread out an organizational chart of courthouse security. Manning isn't just a loose cannon. He's part of a network. Look at this. Every officer who's backed up his questionable stops, every sergeant who's signed off on his reports, every supervisor who's dismissed complaints against him. Hayes studied the chart, seeing connections that formed a web of protection around Manning. They're all connected. More than connected, they're organized. I found emails between Walsh and Shaw discussing how to handle complaints against Manning. They use coded language, but the intent is clear. Protect Manning at all costs.
Torres leaned forward. Why? What makes Manning so valuable that they'd risk their careers to protect him? Brooks's expression darkened. Because he's not just targeting random minorities. He's specifically targeting people who might challenge the system. Civil rights attorneys, activists, journalists covering courthouse stories. Manning has been the courthouse's unofficial gatekeeper, keeping out anyone who might expose problems. The pieces clicked into place for Hayes. The children's charity embezzlement case, the Hartwell trial. Manning knew there would be community activists and journalists observing. He was probably briefed to watch for troublemakers. Exactly, Brooks confirmed. And when he saw you, a black woman in civilian clothes, sitting in the courtroom, he assumed you were there to cause problems. In his mind, he was doing his job. Hayes felt sick. So my assault wasn't random bias. It was systematic suppression of oversight. Torres pulled out another set of documents. It explains why they're fighting so hard to discredit you. If your case succeeds, it will open the door to investigating every complaint Manning has ever faced. It could expose the entire protection network. Brooks nodded. Which is why you're getting death threats. This isn't just about one bad cop anymore. It's about a conspiracy to prevent accountability in the courthouse. Hayes's phone rang. Court Administrator Wilson's name appeared on the screen. Judge Hayes, we need to talk immediately. There have been developments. An hour later, Hayes sat in Wilson's office, facing a room full of officials she recognized but had never seen look so hostile. District Attorney Richard Hawthorne, Chief Judge Margaret Patterson, and Sheriff Tom Bradley formed an intimidating semicircle around her. Victoria, Chief Judge Patterson began, her tone carefully controlled. We've been made aware of some concerning behavior on your part since the incident. Concerning behavior? Hayes kept her voice level despite her racing heart. D.A. Hawthorne leaned forward. You've been working with outside attorneys to investigate courthouse personnel. You've been contacting witnesses and victims of other alleged incidents. This appears to be an attempt to build a case rather than seek a resolution. I'm seeking justice for a criminal assault, something this office should be doing. Sheriff Bradley spoke up. Judge Hayes, we understand you're upset, but continuing down this path will be damaging for everyone involved. Officer Manning is a decorated veteran, and these attacks on his character based on old dismissed complaints are frankly irresponsible. Wilson pulled out a folder. We've prepared an offer that we think resolves this situation fairly. A formal apology from Officer Manning, sensitivity training for all courthouse security, and a substantial settlement for your pain and suffering." Hayes looked at the settlement offer. $250,000 in exchange for dropping all complaints and signing a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. "You want to buy my silence. We want to resolve this professionally," Chief Judge Patterson said. "Taking this public will damage the court system's reputation and undermine public confidence in our institutions." "Our institutions," Hayes repeated slowly. "The same institutions that protected an officer with 37 complaints? The same institutions that are threatening me for seeking accountability?" Dr. Hawthorne's tone hardened. "Judge Hayes, I should mention that some people are questioning whether someone who attacks the credibility of law enforcement should continue presiding over criminal cases." The threat was clear. Take the settlement or face removal from the bench. Hayes realized that even at the highest levels, the system was designed to protect itself rather than deliver justice. "I need time to consider this," Hayes said, standing to leave. As she walked out, she heard Wilson on the phone. "She's not taking the deal. Proceed with the alternative plan." Outside the courthouse, Torres was waiting with Detective Brooks and a woman Hayes didn't recognize, a black journalist whose press credentials identified her as Alicia Thompson from the State Tribune. "Judge Hayes, I've been investigating courthouse corruption for 6 months. After Detective Brooks shared some of your evidence, I think it's time the public knew the truth about what's really happening here." Hayes looked back at the courthouse that had been her professional home for 15 years, then at the people offering to help her fight for justice. "Let's expose it all." The conference room at Torres & Associates buzzed with controlled energy as Judge Victoria Hayes reviewed the mountain of evidence spread across the mahogany table. 3 weeks had passed since her assault, and what had started as a simple complaint had evolved into something much larger. A comprehensive case not just against Manning, but an entire system of institutional bias.
"The testimonies keep coming," Torres said, sliding another affidavit across the table. "This is from attorney Jennifer Washington. She says Manning questioned her credentials 6 different times over the past 2 years, asking if she was sure she was in the right place whenever she appeared in court." Hayes read the statement, her jaw tightening with each paragraph. Washington described being followed to the bathroom, having her briefcase searched without cause, and being asked repeatedly if she was someone's assistant, despite wearing a bar association pin and carrying legal documents. "How many is that now?" Hayes asked, though she already knew the answer. 14, replied Dr. Amara Okafor, the civil rights expert Torres had brought onto the team. 14 documented instances of Manning targeting black court visitors over the past 3 years, all dismissed by Captain Walsh as procedural vigilance. The door opened, and Maria Santos, Hayes's court clerk, entered with a nervous expression. She had been one of the first to come forward, her loyalty to Hayes overriding her fear of retaliation. "Miss Judge," Maria said, setting down a thick folder, "I found something else in the security logs. Look at this pattern." She opened the folder to reveal a chart she'd created tracking courthouse security incidents by race over the past 5 years. The disparity was stark. Black and Latino visitors were detained, questioned, or escorted out at rates nearly 3 times higher than white visitors. Torres leaned forward, studying the data. "Maria, this is incredible work. How did you access these records?" Maria's voice dropped to a whisper. "Officer Rodriguez helped me. She's been keeping her own records because she was tired of seeing what Manning gets away with. She wants to testify, but she's scared about what it'll mean for her job." Hayes felt a familiar surge of hope mixed with anger. Each piece of evidence validated what she'd experienced, while simultaneously revealing how extensive the problem really was. "Can we guarantee Rodriguez protection if she testifies?" "We can try, but whistleblower protection for law enforcement is complicated. She'd be taking a real risk." The conference room door burst open, and Councilwoman Angela Davis strode in with the commanding presence that had made her a force in local politics for 2 decades. Hayes rose to greet her, still adjusting to having such high-profile allies. "Victoria," Davis said, embracing her warmly. "I came as soon as I could. The community response has been incredible. We've got over 3,000 signatures on the petition demanding accountability, and the NAACP is formally backing your case." Davis pulled out her phone, showing a video that had been posted that morning. But this is what's really going to make a difference. On the screen, Reverend Marcus Johnson stood at the podium of his packed church, his voice carrying the moral authority that had made him a leader in the civil rights movement for 30 years. "When they assault our judges, they assault justice itself. When they handcuff our most accomplished professionals, they handcuff our entire community's aspirations. Judge Hayes's fight is our fight, and we will not let it stand alone." The congregation's response was thunderous, and Hayes felt tears prick her eyes. She had spent so much of her career believing that individual excellence could overcome systemic bias, that by proving herself worthy, she could transcend race. Now she was learning that sometimes the fight required community, required standing together rather than standing apart. Torres moved to a whiteboard covered in case strategy notes. "The momentum is building faster than we expected. Channel 7 wants an exclusive interview. The State Bar Association is launching their own investigation, and I've got 3 more attorneys wanting to join our legal team pro bono." What about Manning? How is he responding to all this pressure? Dr. Rocaffer consulted her notes. "According to my sources, he's hired private counsel and is claiming this is all a coordinated attack on law enforcement. His union is backing him fully, and they're pushing a narrative that you're exploiting racial tensions for personal gain." The familiar sting of being accused of playing the race card hit Hayes, but it felt different now, less isolating, more expected. She was learning that speaking truth about racism would always be met with accusations of exaggeration or manipulation. "There's something else," Torres said, his expression growing serious. "We've been approached by other judges, not just locally, but from across the state. Apparently, your case has given them courage to speak up about their own experiences." He handed her a letter from Judge Patricia Chen from the state capitol. She says she was physically searched by court security during a surprise inspection, something that's never happened to any of her white male colleagues. She wants to file an amicus brief supporting our case. Hayes read the letter slowly, absorbing the implications. "This isn't just about what happened to me anymore, is it?" "No," Davis said firmly. "This is about changing how the entire system operates. Your courage to speak up is creating space for others to tell their stories."
Pulled out another document, this one marked with the official seal of the courthouse. "There's more good news. The chief judge has ordered mandatory bias training for all security personnel, and they're implementing new oversight procedures." Torres raised an eyebrow. "That's surprisingly proactive. What's driving the sudden cooperation?" "Public pressure," Davis said with satisfaction. "When the story went viral, every news outlet in the state picked it up. The courthouse can't afford to look like they're ignoring the problem anymore." Hayes walked to the window, looking out at the courthouse building where she'd spent so many years. From here, she could see the steps where protesters had gathered daily since her story broke, holding signs demanding justice and accountability. "You know what surprises me most?" she said quietly. "How many people have told me they're not surprised this happened, as if we've all just accepted that bias and violence are part of how these institutions operate." Torres joined her at the window. "That's exactly why this case matters so much. It's not just about getting justice for what happened to you. It's about saying this isn't acceptable anymore." Dr. Okafor looked up from her legal briefs. "The preliminary hearing is set for next week. Manning's team is going to argue that this was a justified use of force based on reasonable suspicion. They're going to try to put you on trial instead of him." Hayes turned back to the room, her resolve strengthening with each breath. "Let them try. We have the truth, we have evidence, and now we have a community that refuses to let this be swept under the rug."
Davis smiled, the expression carrying decades of hard-won battles. Victoria, I've been fighting these systems for 20 years, and I can tell you this is what victory looks like before it happens. The momentum, the allies, the evidence, the courage to keep pushing when they try to silence you. As the meeting wrapped up and her team prepared for the challenges ahead, Hayes felt something she hadn't experienced since the assault: genuine hope. Not just for her own case, but for the possibility that her pain could become purpose, that her fight could create change extending far beyond her own courtroom. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since Manning had handcuffed her on her own courtroom floor, she believed they could win. The gavel came down with devastating finality. Motion granted. The video evidence is inadmissible due to chain of custody violations. Judge Patricia Morrison's voice echoed through the federal courtroom as Judge Victoria Hayes felt her world collapse around her. 6 months of fighting, 6 months of rebuilding her life and her case, and it was over in a single ruling. Attorney Michael Torres slumped in his chair beside her, his face as ashen as soot. The technical objection had been brilliant in its simplicity. The security footage from Torres's phone had been enhanced by a digital forensics expert, and the defense argued that the enhancement process had altered the original evidence, making it unreliable under federal rules of evidence. Your Honor, Torres stood desperately, the enhancement only clarified existing audio. The original footage clearly shows— Counselor, Judge Morrison interrupted, I've made my ruling. The enhanced audio is speculative at best, and without it, the video merely shows a physical altercation without a clear context of what precipitated it. Behind them, Officer Derek Manning's expensive legal team exchanged satisfied glances. Lead attorney Jonathan Blackwood had earned his reputation destroying civil rights cases on technicalities, and this was just another victory in his spotless record of protecting officers from accountability. Hayes stared at her hands, still bearing faint scars from the handcuffs 6 months ago. Everything they had built, witness testimony, expert analysis of use of force protocols, documentation of Manning's pattern of racial bias, none of it mattered if the jury couldn't see the moment of truth, the moment when Manning had revealed his true motivations. Furthermore, Judge Morrison continued, the plaintiff's witness, Officer Rodriguez, will not be permitted to testify regarding alleged similar incidents without a proper foundation under Federal Rule 404B. These are separate, unsubstantiated allegations that would unfairly prejudice the jury. Hayes closed her eyes. Rodriguez had been their key witness, the officer who had finally found the courage to speak about Manning's pattern of targeting black court visitors. Without her testimony, they had no evidence of systemic bias, just one isolated incident that Manning's team had successfully reframed as a reasonable response to a non-compliant individual. The courtroom behind them was packed with supporters who had followed Hayes's case for months, including members of the NAACP, local activists, and courthouse employees who had witnessed Manning's behavior but were too afraid to testify. She could feel their shock and disappointment like a physical weight. As the court adjourned, Hayes walked through a gauntlet of reporters shouting questions she couldn't answer without crying. Judge Hayes, will you appeal? Do you regret going public with these allegations? How do you respond to claims that you've damaged public trust in the judiciary? That last question stopped her cold. She turned to see Rebecca Martinez from Channel 7, a reporter who had covered the story from the beginning, but whose recent coverage had shifted towards questioning Hayes's motives rather than Manning's actions. Damaged public trust? Hayes asked quietly, her voice barely audible over the courthouse noise. Some legal experts are saying that your decision to pursue this case publicly has raised questions about judicial temperament and whether—
Torres stepped between them. No further questions, he said firmly, guiding Hayes toward the exit. But the damage was done. The narrative had shifted completely. She was no longer the victim seeking justice, but the problem, the troublemaker who couldn't let things go. Outside the courthouse, the scene was even worse. Counter-protesters had joined Manning's supporters, holding signs reading, "Support our officers," and "Stop playing the race card." Hayes recognized some faces from her own courthouse, people she had worked with for years, now standing with her attacker. Manning himself stood on the courthouse steps with his attorney, confident and smiling as cameras clicked around him. "I'm grateful that the court has seen through these baseless accusations," he said into a cluster of microphones. "This has been a difficult time for my family, but we always had faith that the truth would prevail." When asked about Judge Hayes specifically, Manning's expression turned almost sympathetic. "I have nothing but respect for Judge Hayes and her service to this community. I hope she can find peace and move forward from this unfortunate misunderstanding." The word misunderstanding hit Hayes like a slap. 6 months later, he was still calling her assault a misunderstanding, still refusing to acknowledge what he had done, still playing the victim while she bore the scars. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister in Atlanta. "Victoria, I'm seeing the news coverage. Are you okay? Maybe it's time to consider that federal judgeship offer in Georgia. Get away from all this." The federal judgeship offer. It had come 3 weeks ago, quietly, through unofficial channels. A prestigious appointment to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, exactly the kind of career advancement she had dreamed of just a year ago. But the timing felt like a message. Take the promotion, leave town, let this whole mess fade away. Torres found her sitting alone on a bench outside the courthouse, watching the news vans pack up their equipment. The story was over for them. No dramatic courtroom victory, no satisfying conclusion. Just another civil rights case that had fizzled out on technicalities. Torres said, "Victoria, we can appeal the evidence ruling. The 9th Circuit has been more favorable on enhanced video evidence." Hayes shook her head. "Michael, look around. Half the community thinks I'm lying for attention. My own colleagues are distancing themselves from me. The courthouse administration has made it clear they want this to go away. Even if we win on appeal, what then? Another year of this? Another year of being called a troublemaker who damaged the system?" So that's it. Manning walks away? The system protects him and destroys you? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Hayes thought about her parents, about the sacrifices they had made for her education, about the photo on her desk of her swearing-in ceremony where she had promised to uphold justice without fear or favor. "Maybe everyone's right," she said quietly. "Maybe I should have handled this internally. Maybe I should have accepted their quiet settlement and moved on." Torres sat beside her. "Do you really believe that?" Before she could answer, her phone rang. The caller ID showed her Chambers, Maria Santos, her loyal clerk who had stood by her through everything. "Judge Hayes, I'm so sorry about today's ruling, but there's something you need to know. That reporter, Rebecca Martinez, she was just here asking questions about your case files, your judicial record, whether there have been any complaints about bias or temperament." Hayes felt the blood drain from her face. They weren't content to defeat her lawsuit. They were coming after her judicial career itself. The message was clear: back down completely or lose everything. After hanging up, she sat in the growing darkness, watching the last news van drive away. 6 months ago, she had been a respected judge with an unblemished record. Now she was damaged goods, a cautionary tale about what happened when you fought the system instead of working within it. Manning had won more than just a legal victory. He had successfully transformed her from victim to villain, from a symbol of justice to a warning about the dangers of overreaching and playing politics with law enforcement.
The federal judgeship offer suddenly looked less like an opportunity and more like an escape route, a way to leave behind the wreckage of her reputation and start over where nobody knew her as the judge who couldn't let go of a misunderstanding. As Torres drove her home through empty streets, Hayes realized she was facing the hardest choice of her life: accept defeat and salvage what remained of her career, or risk everything on one final stand that might destroy her completely.
The system had made its position clear. The question now was whether she had the strength to keep fighting when everyone, even her supporters, was telling her it was time to surrender. Judge Victoria Hayes sat in her home office at 3 a.m., staring at the email that would either save her career or destroy it completely. The cursor blinked in the subject line: Testimony Request, House Judiciary Subcommittee on Civil Rights. Her hands trembled slightly as she reread Congresswoman Martinez's words. Your voice could change everything, but we understand the personal cost. The personal cost. Hayes looked around the room that had once felt like a sanctuary: her law books, her awards, the photo of her swearing-in ceremony, where she'd believed the system would protect her if she served it faithfully. Now the windows were covered with security film, her mail was screened for threats, and she hadn't slept through the night in weeks. Her phone buzzed. A text from Torres. Settlement offer increased to $2.5 million. They're scared, Victoria, but testifying could mean losing everything. Everything. Her judgeship, her reputation, her safety. The settlement would be quiet, sealed, with a non-disclosure agreement that would silence her forever. Manning would keep his job, the system would remain unchanged, and she could try to rebuild her life in private. But then she thought of the young black attorney she'd seen that morning, hesitating before entering the courthouse, fear flickering across his face as he passed the security desk. She thought of all the others who would face Manning's bias, who wouldn't have her platform or her resources to fight back. Hayes opened her laptop and began typing her response to Congresswoman Martinez. Her fingers moved with growing certainty as the words poured out. Not the careful diplomatic language of a judge, but the raw truth of a woman who had been broken by the system she'd served and was choosing to stand up anyway. I will testify, she wrote. Not for myself, but for every person who has been told they don't belong somewhere because of how they look. This ends with me. She hit send before she could change her mind. The next morning, Torres found her in her chambers, the first time she'd returned since the assault. She was packing her personal items, moving with deliberate calm. Victoria, you don't have to do this, he said, watching her wrap the photo of her parents in tissue paper. The settlement would give you financial security and let you move forward. Hayes paused, holding the picture. Michael, my father used to tell me that dignity isn't something you can buy or sell. It's something you either keep or give away. She looked up at him. I won't give mine away to protect the people who tried to take it from me. The hearing is tomorrow, Torres said quietly. Once you testified publicly, there's no going back. Manning's lawyers will destroy you. They'll question your credibility, your mental state, your motives. The police union has hired the best character assassination team in the country. Let them come, Hayes said, her voice steady. I've been a judge for 15 years. I know how to handle hostile examination. That evening, Hayes's phone rang constantly, colleagues, friends, and family members begging her to reconsider. The most painful call came from her mentor, retired Judge Harrison, who had recommended her for the bench. Victoria, I understand you're angry, but think about your legacy. Do you want to be remembered as the judge who fought for justice, or as the woman who became a symbol of racial division? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Hayes felt the weight of expectation, the pressure to be the respectable victim who suffered in silence for the greater good. Judge Harrison, she said finally, I want to be remembered as the woman who refused to let my assault be swept under the rug so others could continue to feel comfortable with injustice. She hung up and turned off her phone. The morning of the hearing, Hayes stood before her bedroom mirror, adjusting the collar of her navy blue suit. The bruises had faded, but she could still feel them, not just on her body, but on her spirit. The woman looking back at her was different from the one who commanded respect in courtroom 4B. This woman had been broken and rebuilt, scarred but stronger. Torres picked her up at dawn, navigating through the crowd of reporters and protesters that had gathered outside her home. The drive to Washington was silent, both of them lost in the magnitude of what was about to happen. "Judge Hayes," Torres said as they pulled up to the Capitol building, "whatever happens in there, you're the bravest person I know." She squeezed his hand. "Courage isn't the absence of fear, Michael. It's doing what's right despite the fear." The hearing room was packed. Hayes saw Manning's lawyers in the front row, their expressions predatory. Captain Walsh sat with the police union representatives, his face stone cold. But she also saw faces of support, civil rights leaders, other judges who had finally found their voices, and in the gallery, dozens of people who looked like her, who had driven hours to witness this moment.
Congresswoman Martinez called the hearing to order, her voice cutting through the tension. Today, we examine the assault of Judge Victoria Hayes and what it reveals about bias and accountability in our justice system. As Hayes was sworn in, her hand on the Bible, she thought of every person who had been told they didn't belong somewhere because of their race, every victim who had been silenced by systems designed to protect their abusers, every woman who had been blamed for the violence done to her. "Judge Hayes," Congresswoman Martinez began, "please tell this committee, in your own words, what happened in your courtroom." Hayes leaned forward to the microphone, her voice clear and strong. "Congresswoman Martinez, what happened to me was not just an assault on one person. It was an assault on the very idea that justice is blind. It was a reminder that, for some of us, our credentials, our achievements, our dignity can be stripped away the moment someone decides we don't look like we belong." The room was completely silent as she continued. "I am here today not as a victim seeking sympathy, but as a judge demanding accountability. Because if this can happen to me, in my own courtroom, wearing my judicial authority like armor, then what hope do ordinary citizens have?" Manning's lead attorney leaned forward, ready to pounce. But Hayes met his gaze steadily. She had spent her career in courtrooms, facing down hostile witnesses and aggressive lawyers. Today, she wasn't just defending herself. She was defending every person who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. "I am ready for your questions," she said, her voice ringing with the authority that no one could take from her again. Over the next 3 hours, Hayes recounted every detail. Congressman Bradley, known for defending law enforcement, tried to trip her up. "Judge Hayes, isn't it true that you were in civilian clothes and refused to show identification?" "Congressman, I was in my own courtroom preparing for a case. I identified myself verbally multiple times. The question isn't why I didn't have ID. The question is why my word as a sitting judge meant nothing to officers who were supposed to serve that very courtroom." The attorney for Manning's defense tried a different angle. "Your Honor, my client maintains that you became aggressive and made sudden movements that he perceived as threatening." Hayes's expression didn't change. "Counselor, I made sudden movements by trying to stand up from a seated position. I became aggressive by asserting my identity and my right to be in my own workplace. If a black woman calmly stating facts is perceived as threatening, that tells us everything we need to know about the bias in question." The gallery erupted in applause. Martinez had to call for order. Then came the moment that changed everything. Torres, serving as Hayes's counsel, presented the newly discovered security footage, the backup system no one knew existed. The screens lit up with crystal-clear video showing Hayes sitting peacefully, Manning approaching aggressively, Hayes speaking calmly while Manning's body language escalated, and finally, the brutal assault captured in undeniable detail. "As you can see," Torres narrated, "Judge Hayes never raised her voice, never stood aggressively, never posed any threat whatsoever.
What you're witnessing is racial profiling escalating into assault." Manning's attorney visibly deflated. Captain Walsh, watching from the back, quietly slipped out of the room. The hearing concluded with Congresswoman Martinez's powerful statement. "What we've witnessed today is a judge who served justice faithfully, only to be denied that very justice by those sworn to uphold it. This committee will recommend immediate federal prosecution and comprehensive reform." 3 weeks later, the federal criminal trial. The courtroom was packed as the prosecution laid out its case: assault under color of law, civil rights violations, conspiracy to violate constitutional rights. Manning sat at the defense table, no longer confident, his union support having evaporated after the congressional testimony went viral. Officer Rodriguez testified first, finally free to tell the truth. "I heard Manning say multiple times over the years that certain people didn't belong in the courthouse. He specifically targeted black attorneys, visitors, and staff. I was too afraid to report it." Officer Chen took the stand, tears streaming down her face. "I was there. I saw everything. Judge Hayes identified herself clearly. Manning didn't care. He saw a black woman in civilian clothes and decided she was the problem. I should have stopped him. I should have said something. I'll regret my silence for the rest of my life." The defense tried to paint Manning as a dedicated officer, making a split-second decision in a high-stress situation. But the video demolished that narrative. The jury watched Hayes sitting peacefully, watched Manning's aggressive approach, heard her calm identification, saw the unnecessary violence. When Hayes herself testified, the courtroom was silent. She recounted not just the assault, but the years of smaller indignities she'd witnessed in that courthouse. Black attorneys questioned about their credentials, black visitors subjected to extra scrutiny, complaints dismissed and buried. "This wasn't one bad moment," she said, looking directly at the jury. "This was the culmination of a culture that allowed bias to flourish unchecked." The prosecution's closing argument was devastating. "Members of the jury, the evidence is clear. Officer Manning didn't make a mistake. He made a choice rooted in the belief that a black woman couldn't possibly be a judge. That choice led to assault. That choice violated Judge Hayes' civil rights. That choice demands accountability." The verdict. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. When they returned, the 4 women stood. In the case of United States versus Derek Manning, on the count of assault under color of law, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of civil rights violations, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of conspiracy to violate constitutional rights, we find the defendant guilty. Manning's face went white. His attorney slumped in his chair. In the gallery, Hayes closed her eyes and breathed deeply. Not celebration, but relief. Justice, finally. Captain Walsh, watching from the media room, knew his plea deal was the only thing keeping him from a similar fate. He had already agreed to testify about the systemic cover-ups, to cooperate fully with the Reform Committee, and to resign in disgrace. The sentencing, 2 weeks later. Judge Edward Morrison looked down at Manning from the bench. "Officer Manning, you were entrusted with protecting the sanctity of our justice system. Instead, you assaulted one of its guardians. You violated not just Judge Hayes' rights, but the rights of every citizen who trusts that our courthouses are places of fairness and equality. I hereby sentence you to 3 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. May this sentence send a clear message: no one is above the law, and bias in badge form will not be tolerated." As Manning was led away in handcuffs, the same handcuffs he had used on Hayes, the courtroom erupted. Hayes sat quietly, Torres beside her, watching justice finally materialize after months of fighting. Outside on the courthouse steps, reporters swarmed. Hayes made a brief statement. "Today's verdict isn't just about me.
It's about every person who has been judged by their appearance rather than their character. It's about holding systems accountable. And it's about proving that change, though difficult, is possible. That night, Hayes returned to her home, finally able to rest. The battle was over. Justice had been served, and tomorrow the real work of rebuilding would begin. 6 months later, Judge Victoria Hayes stood at the entrance of Courtroom 4B, her hand resting on the polished wooden door. The same door she had walked through countless times before, but today felt different. Today she was returning not just as a judge, but as a symbol of what happened when justice finally prevailed. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the packed gallery. Representatives from civil rights organizations, journalists, courthouse staff, and community members filled every seat. They had come to witness something unprecedented, a judge returning to preside over the very courtroom where she had been assaulted, after successfully prosecuting those who attacked her. "All rise," called Bailiff Thompson, his voice carrying extra weight today. "The Honorable Judge Victoria Hayes presiding." Hayes entered, her black robes flowing behind her with renewed authority. But something had changed in these months of fighting for justice. Her presence now carried not just judicial dignity, but the hard-earned power of someone who had stared down systemic corruption and won. As she took her seat at the bench, Hayes's eyes swept across the courtroom. Attorney Michael Torres sat in the front row, no longer just a witness, but the lawyer who had helped her navigate the most difficult legal battle of her career. Maria Santos, her court clerk, beamed with pride at her desk. Even Officer Rodriguez sat in the gallery, one of the security staff who had finally found the courage to speak truth about Manning's pattern of abuse. But most importantly, the defendant's table sat empty. Derek Manning was serving a 3-year federal sentence for civil rights violations, assault under color of law, and conspiracy to violate constitutional rights. Captain Robert Walsh had pled guilty to obstruction of justice and conspiracy, receiving 2 years in federal prison and losing his pension. The courthouse security that had once protected them now served under completely reformed protocols. "Before we begin today's proceedings," Hayes announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the packed courtroom, "I want to address the elephant in the room. 6 months ago, I was assaulted in this very space by officers who refused to believe I belonged here. Today, I return not as a victim, but as proof that justice, though delayed, can still be achieved." The gallery erupted in applause. Hayes allowed it to continue for several moments before calling for order, not because she was uncomfortable with the recognition, but because she had learned to accept the power of her story to inspire others. "The case before us today," she continued, "involves another situation where power was abused and voices were silenced. Maria Santos versus Clayton Industries, a wrongful termination case where Maria Rodriguez was fired for reporting safety violations that endangered workers." It was no coincidence that Hayes had chosen this case for her return. In the months following her assault, she had become more than just a judge. She had become an advocate for institutional accountability and a voice for those the system typically silenced. During the recess, Torres approached the bench. "Judge Hayes, there's something you should know. The Courthouse Reform Committee just approved the final changes to security protocols, mandatory bias training, independent oversight, and a civilian review board for all security incidents." Hayes nodded, feeling a satisfaction deeper than any legal victory she had previously achieved. "And the scholarship fund?" "Over $200,000 raised so far," Torres smiled. "The Victoria Hayes Justice Scholarship will help dozens of minority law students who want to serve in public interest law."
Community leaders thanked her for her courage. Young lawyers shared how her story had inspired them to take on civil rights cases.
Parents brought their children to meet the judge who had proven that fighting for what's right, even when it's difficult, could create real change. But the most meaningful visit came from an unexpected source. Officer Lisa Chen, Manning's former partner, knocked hesitantly on the door. "Judge Hayes," Chen began, her voice shaking, "I know I don't deserve your time, but I needed to apologize in person. I should have stopped what happened. I should have spoken up sooner." Hayes studied the young officer who had finally testified against Manning in the federal trial. "Officer Chen, what matters now is what you do going forward. Your testimony helped ensure this never happens again." "I've requested a transfer to community policing," Chen said. "I want to learn how to serve people properly, not just enforce authority." Hayes nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of change we need to see." As evening approached, Hayes found herself alone in the courtroom once more, just as she had been on that fateful morning months ago. But this time, she wasn't preparing in secret solitude. This time, she stood at the bench as a transformed leader who had turned personal trauma into systemic change. Her phone buzzed from a text from her parents watching the live stream of her return. "We are so proud of you, Victoria. You didn't just seek justice, you became it." Hayes walked to the witness stand where she had testified before Congress about police misconduct in courthouses. She remembered the moment when her voice had broken while describing the assault, how lawmakers had leaned forward with genuine concern, how her pain had been transformed into policy. The security cameras that had malfunctioned during her assault had been replaced with a state-of-the-art system with independent monitoring. The security staff who had once protected Manning now worked under strict accountability measures. The courthouse that had initially tried to silence her had become a model for justice reform. But perhaps most importantly, Hayes had discovered something about herself. The judge who had once believed that quiet dignity and professional competence could overcome prejudice had learned that sometimes justice required raising your voice, demanding accountability, and refusing to accept that's just how things are. As she prepared to leave her transformed courthouse, Hayes paused at the plaque that now hung outside her courtroom. "In honor of Judge Victoria Hayes, for proving that those who serve justice must also fight for it." Outside, the setting sun painted the courthouse steps in golden light. A small crowd had gathered, not protesters or media, but ordinary citizens who had followed her story and wanted to witness this moment of triumph. Hayes descended the steps with the same measured dignity she had always possessed, but now it carried additional weight. She was no longer just Judge Victoria Hayes. She was a reminder that the system could change, that victims could become victors, and that justice, though sometimes delayed and hard-won, was still possible. In her car, driving home to a family that had supported her through the darkest months, Hayes allowed herself a moment of deep satisfaction. Manning was in prison. Walsh had lost everything. The courthouse had been reformed. And most importantly, the next black woman who entered that courtroom would never face what she had faced. Justice hadn't just been served, it had been transformed. The battle was over, the victory was complete, and the system would never be the same. What does it mean when victims become the agents of their own justice? How can individual courage create the systemic changes that protect everyone? Judge Hayes didn't just win her case, she transformed an entire system. Her courage turned personal trauma into protection for countless others. This is what real justice looks like, and it's what happens when people refuse to stay silent in the face of injustice. If this story moved you, if it made you believe that change is possible, then subscribe now. Share this story with others who need to see that fighting back isn't just possible, it's necessary. Don't let Judge Hayes' victory be forgotten. Hit that subscribe button and help ensure that stories of justice and accountability reach everyone who needs to hear them. The system only changes when we demand it does.
You've come to the end of this love story. But another billionaire's secret is waiting. The next tale will be more seductive, more forbidden, and far more addictive. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one. Until then, guard your heart, because The Powder Room Tales is only getting started.